coming up on Film Nerd by Night.
It was very similar to The Martian. You could tell that it had shared the same DNA, that this was from the same creative mind. They were able to put together a great combination of humor, sci-fi, drama, and heart. There's something very Spielbergian, like 80s Spielberg, about this movie. And I had really only one beef with the entire movie.
And now, the show.
Oh no, it's his underwear.
All right, folks. I'm Cole Powell, musician by day, film nerd by night. Project Hail Mary. I went to see Project Hail Mary this week. This is a lot of hypes around this movie. As a matter of fact, I was beginning to think that it was primarily a marketing PR stunt, and I was going to get the movies and be incredibly disappointed with this film. Much like last year with Thunderbolts, I felt like Thunderbolts last year had a lot of positive critic reviews, a lot of big box office projections going on with it, and I went to see the movie and I realized, like, oh, this was just a giant publicity stunt. Had a lot of financial backing to get word out early to try to turn this into a box office hit, and after the first weekend just kind of fell off because audiences went to see that and it was not the return to form for Marvel that had been predicted. So I felt like that's what was going to happen with this movie. I'm happy to report that's not the case. Yeah, maybe it's just a little overhyped, maybe a little bit, but overall, it was a really solid film. I had a great time in movies. One of the best times I've had in an adult movie, and I don't mean adult as in explicit, but I mean a movie that wasn't made for kids. I've got a lot of kids. I take them to kid-oriented movies all the time, and I have a lot of fun in those movies, but they're not really made for dad. This was made for dad, although it was also made for the whole family too, and I'll talk a little bit more about that later. But this movie is based on the book by Andy Weir, who was the author of The Martian. I've never read the book, but the Ridley Scott film adaptation of that, starring Matt Damon, is one of the best science fiction films of the 21st century so far, and also one of my favorite films this century so far. And this movie, I don't think it was quite as good as The Martian, or even another recent space movie that was done really well, Gravity, but it was very similar to The Martian. You could tell that it had shared the same DNA, that this was from the same creative mind that wrote The Martian. In some ways, the plot's very similar. I'm going to try to be mild spoilers here, but in The Martian, essentially you have a lead character who is a nerdy scientist alone in space, or at least alone, not on Earth. He's technically on a planet in Mars. Project Hail Mary, the same basic premise. This is a nerdy scientist, and he's alone on a spaceship headed towards a particular star. Ryan Gosling, who I absolutely love. He is a very appealing actor. He's one of these actors that he's kind of got an everyman persona. And there's two kinds of great actors. The actors who just completely disappear in the role and become something else. And I think of old school actors. Marlon Brando was like this. More recent actors, Heath Ledger. Then there's the actor that basically plays himself in different roles, and you just buy it. He makes the audience believe that he's still himself, but he is that character. And I heard somebody recently compare Ryan Gosling to Jimmy Stewart. Jimmy Stewart was that type of actor, and 100% Ryan Gosling kind of embodies, has that same Jimmy Stewart type appeal. And no matter what kind of character he plays, I always buy him in the role, even though he doesn't act necessarily that much different. He's always Ryan Gosling. This movie, he did an excellent job. This was directed by Phil Lord and Chris Miller, who are probably most famous for their animated, more children, family-oriented pictures, Cloudy with a Chance Meatballs franchise, Lego Movie, and Spider-Verse films, which all of those were really good, and they were also really unique and creative. Now they're doing, I think they've actually done some live action stuff before. I'm not sure if I've seen any of their live action material, but they've moved to live action and they've brought that same sensibility of uniqueness to this. And I haven't read the book Project Hail Mary, so I can't comment on how much was changed from page to screen. But whatever the recipe is here, how much ever was Andy Weir's original book, or Drew Goddard, who wrote the script, or Lord Miller directing, they were able to put together a great combination of humor, sci-fi, drama, and heart. And it all works very well. I mentioned earlier, is very much like The Martian. The Martian was essentially a sci-fi comedy, but not a comedy in the absurd, bombastic way. Instead, it was more of an intelligent, subtle humor, and that's what this movie has in it. But it also has great cinematography. There's a particular aesthetic that modern space movies are supposed to have or expected to have, and this movie just nails it. You buy it, you buy the ship, you buy Ryan Gosling in space, you buy the alien, you buy everything. As far as the plot, I lost count of the number of twists in this movie. Like, you think it's going to go one way, or you're not sure where it's going, and where it goes is not what you had in your head at all. And even like the last 15, 20 minutes of the movie, there's like 3 or 4 big plot twists. But it works. It's not overkill. It may sound overkill, but it's not. It's also told in nonlinear format. I love nonlinear storytelling. It's my favorite type of storytelling when done right. Sometimes I've seen nonlinear films that don't work well because they just the director, or maybe the script just doesn't know how to really incorporate the nonlinear elements. This is not that case. This works perfectly. There is a plot device that we're introduced to as soon as the movie starts. Ryan Gosling's character wakes up on a spaceship from an induced coma, and he has amnesia, which was an expected side effect or a common side effect of being put in this induced coma. So he has no idea who he is. And we're getting flashbacks of his backstory. And the idea is we're seeing him remember this stuff. That's not articulated specifically, but that's what we get from the way that it's put together, the way it's shot and edited. And it works so well. We see him on the spaceship, getting familiar with the ship and his mission, and also we get to see the flashbacks as he's remembering who he is and how he got there. And there's one of the last twists of the movie is actually one final flashback where we learn what happened right before he got on the ship. And I really enjoyed that. It was unexpected, and it made the character look worse in one way, but ultimately better in another way. And that's a really hard balance to get. There was also, and this is going to be a little bit of a spoiler here, if you've seen any of the trailers, I didn't watch any of the trailers. I was originally going to do a reaction to at least one of the trailers, never got to it, and I finally decided I'm not going to watch any of this. So I did not know this going in. I've been told they spoiled this in the trailer, but it's essentially a buddy becomes, about an hour into the movie, a buddy alien movie. And there's an alien character on there who's introduced who is just lovable. You immediately love him. His name is Rocky. And there's a whole bit about them watching the movie Rocky. This movie also goes back to using practical effects. I have always been a champion of practical effects. I remember when the digital started coming out with Episode 1, Star Wars Episode 1, The Phantom Menace was really the first big major CG heavy film. And I was sitting in theaters. I was a kid. I still loved the film at the time because, yeah, I was super young and, didn't really have a grasp on great narrative criticism. But I really enjoyed the film. But the one thing that I really didn't like, that I hated, was the CG, because it just did not look as real as the models and the puppets and the animatronics and the masks and the costumes from the original Star Wars. And I've said this in videos before. I think that we actually reached peak CG a few years ago, and it's just kind of been going downhill ever since. It looks less and less realistic. And I feel like people are starting to want and demand something that's more real. And I know some of the newer Star Wars properties have gotten back to some of the practical effects. And now this movie, from my understanding, there was no green screen on this at all, which is incredible. They use real sets, real models, real electronics, real animatronics, and even the alien character Rocky that I mentioned earlier, even he was an animatronic from my understanding, not CG at all. And it shows. It looks much more realistic than what we've been used to for the last 25 years in cinema. And there's something very Spielbergian, like 80s Spielberg, about this movie, particularly in the heart and the family orientation of the film. I mentioned at the top, it's made for adults, but it's also made for the whole family. I could have brought my kids to this. Some of the younger ones probably wouldn't have been able to sit there for as long as the movie was and wouldn't have been as interested into it, but there was nothing objectionable in the film, which is shocking in today's age. There was no profanity. There was no adult content or really references. Maybe it was one kind of joke that arises from the alien using a colloquialism incorrectly, and it sounded really bad. But other than that, really, really clean film, something you can take your kids to. And that was shocking in today's age. But the plot also, and I'm going to kind of put on my philosophy and religion degrees hats here, it was surprisingly a lot of religious references, but not explicit. Just even some of nomenclature. The film is called Project Hail Mary, which obviously that's referring to the Hail Mary pass in football. That's a last-ditch effort, and that's what this movie is about. This is a last-ditch effort to save humanity. But it also, of course, refers to the Hail Mary prayer. The lead character, Ryan Gosling's lead character's surname that he goes by through the entire picture is Grace, which obviously that's got some religious connotation there. And he's trying to save the world. So obviously you've got, a cross parallel. There was also a scene in this movie. It's interesting to me because Andy Weir, from my understanding, Andy Weir is not religious. Like, that's part of his thing. He's not really religious. But there was a line in here. I don't know whether this is in the book or not, but there was a line in the movie where the female lead in this movie, who is the head of this international group that's putting this mission together to try to save the world, she says something to Ryan Gosling about God, and Ryan Gosling says, "Do you believe in God?" And she said, "Well, it's better than the alternative," which is something we're not used to hearing in a modern Hollywood production, but there it was. And another thing that was really interesting about this movie was it kind of got back to a more classic sci-fi disaster motif, because in a lot of modern sci-fi, when there is some kind of cataclysmic disaster pending, it's the human's fault. Like, we caused it. I think about Snowpiercer. I remember Day After Tomorrow. This is kind of back to what old school disaster films were, that you had something that happened outside of Earth, of human control, like an asteroid or something. I think about even Armageddon, that's headed toward Earth, and humanity has to use its ingenuity to try to fight back against that. And in this case, it was a unique concept, which was these cells, some kind of alien cells that were attracted to and fed on stars, and they have shown up all over the solar system eating stars, and they're eating our sun, and it's going to eventually destroy Earth, and the humans got to pull together and try to figure out a way to combat this. And that's an old school sci-fi sensibility. At the same time, it looked like that this was going to be a picture that science ultimately solves all problems without creating any. That's where it seemed to be that they were going with this. And I was kind of like, if that's where they're going, okay, I'll accept it for the sake of the movie, but that's not realistic because in real life, science usually, even if it solves a problem, usually it creates something that wasn't expected or some kind of unintended consequences that we then have to create something else to try to combat. And it looked like that they were going to kind of avoid that in this movie until we get down toward the end. And one of the final twists, actually, there was something they missed, something they weren't prepared for, and it almost caused a catastrophe, and it required Ryan Gosling, the lead character, to make one final decision about his life, what he was going to do. And at first, I wasn't sure if I was happy with the decision his character made, but then they have a couple of more sequences in the film to kind of wrap everything up, and I liked it. It turned out really, really good. My only beef, and I had really only one beef with the entire movie, it's too long. This is a 2.5-hour movie, and it did not really justify its length. It was about an hour into the movie before I looked at my phone to see what time it was, see how long I'd been there. And my thought was we should be a little past the halfway mark. But when I looked at my phone and realized that we were an hour in the movie, I was like, oh, we've got a long way to go. This is going to be an overly long film. And as it went on, I could see in the moments, in the sequences where this movie should have been trimmed. I'm not sure why the filmmakers decided to make it this long when there were some obvious cuts that could have been made to kind of trim this down. I think this could have been done in 2 hours max, maybe even an hour and 45 without an issue. For some reason, movies have been trending long. I know Christopher Nolan kind of brought that to I feel like back to the mainstream, back to the forefront. I know in the 50s and the 60s, there were a lot of big, long, epic movies. I think of Dr. Zhivago, Lawrence of Arabia, a couple of David Lean films. I think of Giant. And I've heard the reason that they started making these films longer at that period was to give people more bang for their buck, or at least make them think they're getting more bang for their buck. Because if you're paying the same ticket price for a 3-hour movie that you'd be paying for a 90-minute movie, well, that's like, you're getting like double your money's worth out of there. But when I watch those films, I don't really think that they're too long. I don't really think that they necessarily needed to be edited because they're made to function more as a classic epic novel. And in a classic epic novel, you are supposed to kind of live in that world, and you're supposed to get to know those characters. You have time to get in there. And I feel like some of those movies in the 50s and 60s that were overly long by today's standard, they justified their length because they played like an epic novel. This movie did not do that. This is not that kind of film. This movie demanded, I feel like, more of a more brisk pace than what we got. And I think it would have been a better movie. My objective rating on this, I would give it a 9 out of 10. It's really, really great. My personal subjective rating, I would give this an 8 out of 10. I didn't enjoy it quite as much as I did The Martian. I mentioned earlier Gravity, a couple of really great modern space films, but it's still really good. I highly recommend this picture. It did excellent box office numbers over the opening weekend, $80 million domestic, 140 international. And I saw this on Tuesday afternoon at the theater that's nearest my house, a little small town theater. and there were 15 people in there, which is pretty big for a Tuesday 4 p.m. show in a small town. And it was the age demographics, it was just about across the board. We had 30s and 40s couples, we had elderly couples, we had young girls, we had some teenage boys in there. It was just a good sample of all age groups. That bodes well for this film. I think it's going to do really well. And what this proves to Hollywood, I hope they take this lesson from it, is that audiences want to see films with good directing, good acting, good script, good message that everybody can see and that have old school classic cinema sensibilities. That's what I feel like this movie had. If you haven't seen it, go check it out as soon as you can. If you have seen it, let us know in the comments what you thought about this movie. Are you like me? Did you think it was fantastic? Maybe you were a little more on the fence about it, or you just couldn't stand it. Let us know in the comments. If you enjoyed that clip, be sure to follow the Film Nerd by Night podcast wherever you're getting this episode. Also, consider supporting us on Patreon for full-length movie reactions and early access to episodes like this. Stay tuned. We'll see you next time.
Film Nerd by Night, created and hosted by Cole Powell. Theme, Beautiful Now, written and performed by Cole Powell, a Randomine Records production. Section 107 of U.S. copyright law allows for the fair use of copyrighted material for purposes such as criticism, comment, news reporting, teaching, parody, or research.